Hello, hello, hello. Do you hear me?
Hola, hola, hola. ¿Me oís?
Yo te oigo muy bien. ¿Me oyes?
Sí, pero no debería oírte. Pero bueno,
Sí, 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 sí.
Eric, can you hear me?
I hear you loud and clear.
Okay. I would like to make a very short check with the Discord, Spanish Discord channel, because I understand I have to follow that
Yes.
in order to have the...
With one ear, follow Spanish. With the other ear, you follow yourself.
My earphones. Okay. My computer is boiling.
Well, and mine also.
Let's hope it doesn't break down in the middle of the lead-off.
No, but we have your lead-off. We can read it if you're not
Yeah,
there.
okay, you read it.
Yes.
Is Pablo Sanchez here?
He is here.
Okay, he can read it.
10 seconds, I think.
Ready to go.
Okay, empezamos. Let's start. Hello, everybody. Hello, the world. My name is Eric. I'm from the Belgium section of the IMT.
Hola a todos.
If you hear me pause, that's because we have a translation going on after every sentence in 12 different languages.
Sí, me oís.
This is the session on Marxism against sectarianism. Claudio Bellotti from the Italian section will be the speaker.
Esta es la sesión de marxismo contra el sectarismo y Claudio Bellotti de la sección italiana introducida.
You will see on your left hand of the screen all the possibilities of language translation.
Veréis a la izquierda de la pantalla todas las lenguas a las que se interpreta.
And you will also find a button for the schedule of the other sessions today, tomorrow, and Tuesday.
Junto con la agenda de los próximos días.
Well, without further ado, I'll ask Claudio to speak, and he's going to speak now. Claudio.
Sin nada más, le pido a Claudio que tome la palabra.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Can you hear me? Thank you.
Eric, ¿me oís?
Good afternoon or good night, everyone here.
Buenas tardes, buenas noches, según donde estéis.
I will start with a short quote from a letter Karl Marx wrote in 1871. The International was founded in order to replace the socialist or semi-socialist sects by a real organization of the working class for struggle. The original statutes and the inaugural address show this at the first glance. On the other hand, the internationalists could not have maintained themselves if the course of history had not already smashed up the sectarian system. The development of the system of the socialist sects and that of the real workers' movement always stand in inverse ratio to each other. So long as the sects are historically justified, the working class is not yet ripe for an independent historic movement. As soon as it has attained this maturity, all sects are essentially reactionary. And nevertheless, what history has shown everywhere was repeated within the International. The antiquated makes an attempt to re-establish and maintain itself within the newly achieved form.
Lo antiguo intenta restablecerse y mantenerse en una nueva forma.
In this letter, Marx referred to the First International.
En esta carta que Marx refiere a la Primera Internacional,
And the internal struggle between socialists and anarchists that ultimately ended with the dissolution of that organization.
y la lucha entre socialistas y anarquistas que en última instancia llevó a la disolución de la Primera Internacional.
And many times, starting with the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels criticized those communist and socialist tendencies, schools and sects.
Muy a menudo, y empezando por el Manifiesto Comunista, Marx y Engels critican estas tendencias comunistas o socialistas, estas escuelas de sectarianismo.
That preached socialism and their particular recipe for rebuilding society according to justice.
Grupos que predican el socialismo y su receta particular para reconstruir una sociedad justa.
And that was the infancy of the workers' movement.
Esto era durante la niñez.
The working class had not yet developed its own independent organizations.
El momento en el que la clase obrera aún no había desarrollado sus organizaciones independientes.
And its aspirations and its needs were mainly expressed through the propaganda of the utopian socialists of different shades.
Y cuyas aspiraciones y necesidades se expresaban mayoritariamente en grupos de propaganda en lo que llamamos socialistas utópicos.
In that sense, the struggle to move forward from that embryonic stage can be considered won, and that stage has been overcome since long.
En ese sentido, esta etapa embriónica del movimiento obrero puede ser ya considerada terminada y pasada desde hace.
It is true that with the fall of the Soviet Union and the ensuing ideological reaction,
Aunque es cierto que con la caída de la Unión Soviética y la ola reaccionaria que siguió,
many mass movements saw a revival of utopian ideas about how to overcome the evils of capitalism.
muchos movimientos de masa vivieron un revivir de ideas utópicas sobre cómo acabar con los males del capitalismo.
That was particularly evident in the so-called anti-globalization movement in the early 2000s.
Esto era particularmente obvio en el llamado movimiento antiglobalización de principios de este siglo.
But those ideas were generated not in the working class, but in the petty bourgeois sectors.
Pero estas ideas no nacieron en el seno de la clase obrera, sino entre capas pequeñoburguesas,
Which tried to figure out a way to resist the crushing pressure of finance capital.
que buscaban una manera de resistir a la presión agobiante del capitalismo financiero.
But sectarianism reappeared, as Marx wrote, in a new shell many times along the history of the working class and the revolutionary movement.
Marx explicó, el sectarismo ha reaparecido en nuevas formas varias veces a lo largo de la historia del movimiento obrero revolucionario.
It would be easy to list some of the features which characterize sectarian tendencies and organizations.
Es fácil hacer una lista de las características de las organizaciones o tendencias sectarias.
The one-sidedness, for instance.
La visión sesgada de los acontecimientos.
The tendency to accept only some forms of the class struggle.
La tendencia a aceptar solo algunas formas de la lucha de clase.
There are sects, for instance, who consider that only strikes are a real proletarian form of struggle, denying any other activity as opportunistic.
Hay grupos, por ejemplo, que consideran que solo la huelga es una manera proletaria de lucha y niegan cualquier otro tipo de método de lucha.
Or groups that dedicate themselves exclusively to propaganda, dissociating it from any activity in the movement.
Otros se dedican única y exclusivamente a la propaganda, alejándose de cualquier actividad real en el seno del movimiento.
In 1935, Trotsky dealt with the question of sectarian tendencies inside those forces that were trying to build the Fourth International.
En 1935, Trotsky habló y escribió sobre las tendencias sectarias en el seno de las fuerzas que estaban construyendo la Cuarta Internacional.
And it was not the first nor the last time that he had to write on this.
Aunque 1935 no era ni la primera ni la última vez que tuvo que hablar de este tema.
Here are some passages from this article.
Voy a leer unas citas de este artículo.
Every working class party, every faction,
cualquier partido, cualquier facción,
passes during its initial stages through a period of pure propaganda, i.e. the training of its cadres.
pasa en los periodos iniciales a través de un periodo de propaganda pura, exclusiva, es decir, la formación de sus cuadros.
The period of existence as a Marxist circle engrafts invariably habits of an abstract approach to the problems of the workers' movement.
Este periodo de existencia, los círculos marxistas, graba de manera inevitable hábitos, costumbres abstractas de la manera de tratar los temas.
He who is unable to step in time over the confines of this circumscribed existence becomes transformed into a conservative sectarian.
Aquellos que no sean capaces de salir de esta situación se verán transformados en sectarios conservadores.
The sectarian looks upon life in society as a great school with himself as a teacher there.
Mira a la sociedad como una escuela en la cual él es el profesor.
During a certain stage of development, rationalism is progressive.
En algunos momentos del desarrollo, el racionalismo progresista.
I'm cutting down the quote. The progressive stage of rationalism is repeated in every great emancipatory movement.
La etapa progresista del racionalismo se repite en cada movimiento de emancipación.
But rationalism, or abstract propagandism, becomes a reactionary factor the moment it is directed against the dialectic.
El racionalismo o la propaganda progresista puede llegar a jugar un papel conservador si se enfrenta a un análisis dialéctico.
Sectarianism is hostile to dialectics not in words but in deeds, in action. In the sense that it turns its back upon the actual development of the working class.
10 minutes.
This is Trotsky in 1935. And this approach he was talking about often presents itself in a negative form, that is, the demonization of this or that form of struggle.
Y esta visión de la cual habla se presentaba de una manera negativa, criticando esta u aquella forma de lucha como negativa, como incorrecta.
Be it the parliamentary struggle, the economic struggle, and so on, with the promise that if the movement stays away from them, it will be free from the danger of opportunism and degeneration.
La lucha parlamentaria o la lucha económica o la lucha sindical, diciendo que si se mantiene lejos de una o de otra, estará alejado de los peligros.
And all these mistakes and many others show a clear trait of idealism and subjectivism.
Y todos todas estas tendencias y algunas más muestran una visión subjetiva e idealista.
They try to build their own working class, their own workers' movement, instead of studying and intervening in the real class struggle.
Es un intento de construir su propia clase, su propio movimiento, en vez de analizar el movimiento existente e intentar de intervenir en el movimiento vivo.
By taking reality as a starting point and not any principle invented in a closed room.
No toman la realidad como el punto de partida, sino unos principios abstractos desarrollados en alguna sala de conferencias.
However, I would warn against a discussion that sets off from a mere list of sectarian traits or features.
Sin embargo, no voy a defender una discusión no voy a hacer una lista de los diferentes grupos sectarios.
Like any other political phenomenon, sectarianism is rooted in the class struggle.
Como casi cualquier otro fenómeno político, el sectarismo tiene su raíz.
It is not enough to find the definition of it and to apply to a given tendency to see whether it fits or not into it.
No es suficiente tener una definición y aplicarla o no a un grupo particular y ver si la definición es correcta o no.
This approach is only a first step, but being purely static, it cannot show the objective roots and development of that particular phenomena.
Esta manera de ver es solo el primer paso que se debe dar, ya que es puramente estático, no puede analizar ni las raíces ni el proceso de desarrollo del fenómeno particular.
Like some of the older comrades here, I have been a member of the CWI, the Committee for the Workers International. Which was a Marxist organization that degenerated into a sect. And that was due both to objective and subjective reasons I will touch briefly later on.
Y esto fue a causa de cuestiones objetivas y subjetivas. Más tarde tocaré el tema.
That was an example of sectarianism which came about as a part of a defeat of the working class internationally.
Un ejemplo del sectarismo que dio la luz en parte a una derrota de la clase obrera a nivel internacional.
The defeat of the workers' movement at the beginning of the 80s of the last century.
Las derrotas de la clase obrera a principios de los años 80 del siglo pasado.
But history shows us other and different examples.
Pero la historia nos muestra otros y muy diferentes.
In the founding years of the Communist International, Lenin and Trotsky had to wage a very serious and principled battle against the sectarian tendencies in the newly formed communist parties.
En los años de fundación de la Internacional Comunista, la Internacional y Trotsky llevaron a cabo una batalla importante y de principios contra las tendencias sectarias y los jóvenes partidos comunistas.
That was particularly true for the German and the Italian communist parties, but others as well, like the British.
Esta lucha es muy particular, ejemplar, si quiere, en el partido alemán e italiano, pero también en muchos otros, como por ejemplo el británico.
In that case, the sectarian tendency manifested themselves among sectors of the working class and specifically of its vanguard.
En estos casos, estas tendencias sectarias se manifestaban entre sectores de la clase obrera y muy particularmente en su vanguardia.
That is, revolutionary workers and militants who had been repelled by the betrayal of the Second International during World War I.
Trabajadores y activistas revolucionarios que habían sido, que odiaban, ¿no?, la traición de la Segunda Internacional durante la Primera Guerra Mundial.
And galvanized by the Russian Revolution, reacted vehemently against the social democracy.
Y galvanizados por la Revolución Rusa, su comportamiento era de odio visceral hacia la socialdemocracia.
They rallied to the Communist International, which, by the way, explicitly appealed the ultra-left and semi-anarchist tendencies.
Se juntaron en la Internacional Comunista, que hacía llamamientos a la y semi-anarquistas,
Like the French syndicalists, the Spanish CNT, or the IWW in the US, they appealed to join ranks with the International Communist International.
La Internacional Comunista llamó a los sindicalistas franceses, a la CNT española y a los Wobles americanos a juntarse con ellos.
That was absolutely correct at that time, as the sectarian traits could be overcome with a combination of principled and democratic discussion and the living experience of the mass revolutionary movement that was developing.
Esto era una posición correcta, dada la línea de desarrollo que tenían estas organizaciones, que podían ser ganadas juntos, esta política con una lucha conjunta.
Lenin's masterpiece Left-Wing Communism and many documents and speeches from the second and third congresses of the International reports the fruits of that battle, of that discussion.
La infantil del comunismo de Lenin, maestra, y muchas resoluciones del segundo y tercer congreso internacional son un ejemplo de esta discusión y de este intento de ganar estas organizaciones.
Big emphasis was put in explaining the need to sink roots in the trade unions to win the majority of the working class to the revolutionary program and perspective.
Un esfuerzo muy grande y un ejemplo es cómo profundizar las raíces a través de estas discusiones en la masa de la clase obrera y el movimiento revolucionario.
To make good use of all the different fields of activity in order to build the revolutionary party.
Cómo utilizar todos los campos de trabajo y de lucha para ganar la vía revolucionaria.
And the question of the united front was at the core of these debates, as well as the question of the workers' government or workers' and peasants' government, according to the different countries.
Y el debate único
20 minutes.
en el centro de esta discusión, así como la cuestión del gobierno obrero y del gobierno obrero y campesino, según los países en los que se discutía con esto.
The underlying idea can be synthesized this way.
La idea de fondo de este periodo se puede resumir de esta manera.
That in order to reach the masses that still follow the reformist leaders of the social democracy and the trade unions,
Para ganarse a las masas que aún siguen vigentes la evolución de las organizaciones reformistas y socialdemócratas,
it is not enough just to appeal to them to leave their organizations and join the revolutionary party.
no es suficiente hacer un llamado a que dejen sus organizaciones y que se unan a la organización revolucionaria comunista.
It is necessary to address their leaders in order to reach their members.
Es necesario poner en jaque, cuestionar a sus líderes para llegar a esa base.
It is necessary to put before the reformist leader precise demands for united action, to reach the masses over the heads, if you like, of the reformist bureaucracy.
Es necesario poner frente a la organización reformista demandas concretas de acción unificada para llegar a las masas saltándose a esta dirección.
This approach was rooted in the experience of the Russian Revolution itself between February and October 1917.
Esta
At that time, the Bolsheviks, as a tiny minority in the Soviets, openly appealed to the reformist leader, defying them to take power, or inviting them to take power. In the same way, in August 1917, they applied a united front tactic to fight Kornilov's attempted coup. And that tactic was absolutely essential in order to prepare the October Revolution. And of course, the United Front is not a panacea to be employed always and under any circumstance. As Trotsky remarked, it would have made no sense, for instance, to appeal to the reformist leader to organize the seizure of power in October. As I said before, the ultra-left tendencies were strongly present in the Third International at its inception. And the Bolshevik Party itself was not immune from this tendency in 1919. The idea of a communist leap was present not only amongst the left communists, that is, Bukharin and others.
La idea del salto comunista no existía solo entre dirigentes de las llamadas comunistas de izquierda, como Marx, etc.
In 1921, at the Third Congress of the Communist International, Trotsky honestly explained, that in 1919 there was the hope that capitalism could be toppled in Europe by a single assault.
En el tercer congreso internacional comunista, Trotsky explicó de manera honesta que había una capa de dirigentes de comunistas que pensaba que el capitalismo podría ser derribado en 1919 de un solo golpe.
That the revolution could storm and conquer in a sweep the whole of the continent.
Que la revolución podría saltar y de un golpetazo barrer a través del continente europeo.
But despite the great revolutionary elan, with the revolutionary situation in Hungary, in Bavaria, in Italy, and so on, the events gave proof that in order to win the revolution in Central and Western Europe, a deeper preparation was needed.
Y a pesar de que hubo una ola con la revolución húngara, la revolución bávara en Italia, etcétera, esta ola pasó y se vio claramente que hacía falta preparar de manera consciente.
And that the Communist International had to seriously undertake this task if it was to fulfill its historical task and not to degenerate into a sect. In a certain sense, we could say that those sectarian tendencies were a healthy reaction which reflected the growing radicalization of the best vanguard of the working class.
De algún modo, podemos decir que esa tendencia sectaria es una reacción sana y que demostraba este proceso de radicalización.
They could be corrected, and in many cases they actually were corrected, from the infantile disorder, and that was Lenin's and Trotsky's approach. And Lenin clearly stated that even too often, the ultra-left mistakes were a retribution for the opportunistic sins of the reformist bureaucracy.
Y algunas veces incluso Lenin llegó a decir que los errores ultraizquierdistas eran el precio a pagar por los pecados reformistas del pasado.
Therefore, in order to understand it, it's not just a question of finding a definition of sectarianism, good for all times and all circumstances.
Por lo tanto, es una cuestión de comprensión, no de definiciones estáticas que sirvan para siempre jamás.
But we must rather understand the process.
Debemos entender el proceso.
The working class is not a monolith, is not homogeneous.
La clase obrera no es un monolito homogéneo.
Different economic conditions, different experiences will give rise to different political consciousness.
Diferentes situaciones económicas, diferentes eventos darán fruto diferentes niveles de conciencia política.
There is also the pressure of other classes, like the lower strata of the petty bourgeoisie or semi-proletarian sections of the working class.
También está la cuestión de la presión de otras clases. Por ejemplo, los sectores más unidos de la pequeña burguesía o los sectores más desproletarianizados,
Which under certain objective circumstances can become very active and develop a confused anti-capitalist consciousness.
que bajo ciertas circunstancias pueden desarrollar ciertas circunstancias objetivas, pueden desarrollar un radicalismo anticapitalista negativo.
This is certainly true in the present epoch, when the crisis of the capitalist system destabilizes and threatens their condition of existence.
Esto es cierto, actual, el capitalismo
The so-called populism, which puzzles the progressive intellectuals, must be explained firstly by this objective basis.
el llamado populismo
This movement, and I'm referring to those petty bourgeois movements who are more or less confusedly on the left, certainly have an influence on the working class.
estos movimientos
30 minutes.
izquierdas y también
Particularly when the class is not mobilized, and they can create a fertile ground for impatience or hope for easy miracles and adventurous trends in minority sections of the working class.
particularmente en periodos en los que la sociedad se ha movido, puede generar una serie de tendencias a la impaciencia, a buscar caminos más cortos en el seno de una etapa de la clase.
In the trade union movement, we also witness many times the emergence of ultra-left tendencies to split away from the mass trade unions.
En el seno de los sindicatos también hemos visto muchas veces la emergencia de corrientes, tendencias izquierdistas que buscan distinguirse de
These phenomena did arise from different material bases.
este fenómeno surge de diferentes bases.
Sections of the working class can find themselves in a particular condition that pushes them to act independently from the general movement.
Sentido, instituciones de la clase obrera pueden encontrarse en una posición en la cual se ven obligados a actuar independientemente del movimiento general.
In most cases, this is a combination of objective and subjective factors.
A menudo esto es una combinación de factores objetivos y subjetivos.
The trade union bureaucracy often acts as a block for the organization of a given layer of the working class, particularly amongst the most oppressed and the most exploited sections.
sindical es una barrera a la organización de las capas más explotadas de la clase.
Agricultural laborers, for instance, very often immigrants, living in a very precarious existence, are seen with suspicion, are kept segregated by the reformist bureaucracy.
Por ejemplo, los obreros, los trabajadores del campo, muy inmigrantes, viviendo en unas condiciones de existencia muy precarias, miran con sospecha y no se fían de la burocracia reformista.
And in many countries, they give a point of support for independent trade unions.
Y son, de hecho, en muchos países la base material para sindicatos independientes.
In Spain, the SOCs, the Sindicato Obreros del Campo, which later evolved in the SAT, is a good example of these militant and fighting trade unions.
En España, el SOC, el Sindicato del Campo, luego SAT, es un buen ejemplo de este tipo de activistas.
These fighting trade unions, which can actually become majority unions in a given section, in a given industry or region, while being a minority in relation to the labor movement in general.
Los sindicatos combativos pueden incluso llegar a ser mayoritarios en alguna región o en algún sector, pero siempre una minoría en relación al conjunto del movimiento.
Historically, the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies in the US, are a good example of this.
Históricamente, International Workers of the World, Wobblies, en los Estados Unidos, esencialmente es un buen ejemplo.
This has always been connected to the subjective action of political cadres from left-wing and sectarian organizations.
Estos acontecimientos suelen siempre estar acompañados de la actividad consciente de los militantes y activistas.
In some industries and trades in different countries, we see similar developments.
En algunos sectores y en algunos países vemos
In the logistic delivery industry, for instance, we see many examples of this sort of organizations.
en el sector de la logística y del reparto, delivery, etcétera, vemos este tipo de iniciativas desarrolladas.
The fast growth of these industries through the e-commerce in recent years gave a certain bargaining power to the workforce.
El desarrollo del comercio digital online ha dado cierta capacidad de negociación a estos trabajadores.
While the official trade unions quite often are incapable of reaching these workers and to confront giant companies like Amazon, United Parcel Service, and so on, when they are not directly in the pocket of the management, which is often the case.
En la medida en que los grandes organizaciones sindicales son incapaces de llegar a estos trabajadores que se organizan, si es que no están en los sitios de la organización, que es bastante a menudo.
In this regard, the theses and documents of the first congresses of the Communist International are compulsory reading for all of us.
En este sentido, los primeros documentos, las tesis de los primeros congresos de la Internacional Comunista son lectura obligada.
The Communist International clearly stated that an active and organized work inside the mass reformist trade unions was a duty for every communist party, and no exceptions were allowed.
La comunista claramente decía que el trabajo de los comunistas, de los comunistas, de los sindicatos comunistas, era un deber de todos los miembros, sin excepción.
And it warned against the splits that separate the most advanced layer from the mass of the class.
Y avisaba
thus facilitating their isolation and repression both from the bureaucracy, the bosses, and the state.
Además, facilitaba la protección contra las etapas más avanzadas y el aislamiento gracias al papel, permitía que la burocracia del Estado y los empresarios
At the same time, the Communist International stated that this formula was not to be turned into a dogma or a fetish. In those cases where the bureaucracy actively and effectively blocked the organization of the section of the workers, the setup of independent trade unions was considered as an option. Provided that it was understood by the workers and that a united front tactic was consistently employed and applied towards the majority trade unions. History showed that these militant and minority unions never developed beyond a certain point. And when they reach that limit, they lose their workers' base and turn into ossified sects or disintegrate. And the only answer lies in the theoretical and political approach to this phenomenon. Quite often, these small radical unions are influenced by another distortion. That is a tendency to confuse economic and political struggle. And just like they hope to bypass the obstacle of the reformist bureaucracy by setting up a separate union.
40 minutes.
They hope to solve the question of the political leadership of the proletariat by using these unions as a substitute for a political party. This conception has a clear anarchist or anarcho-syndicalist origin, but at times it has been adopted by cadres of Marxist or semi-Marxist background. So it is absolutely essential for us to discuss the relationship between the economical and political struggle, both in general and at every concrete turn of the events. And as well as the relationship between the different layers of the working class and their mutual connections.
y las conexiones.
Only through this constant theoretical training we can effectively intervene in this field, build a fruitful relation with these struggles.
Solo a través de esta formación teórica constante, discusiones, podemos intervenir de manera concreta y tener una relación útil con todos estos tipos de luchas.
And fight to avoid that good working class fighters are lost for the cause when the limitations and the mistakes of this strategy become apparent.
Y a luchar para evitar que buenos luchadores sean perdidos en la frustración y en las limitaciones de los errores que se hacen
At the height of the mass movement, the consciousness tend to be more homogeneous.
En los momentos de alza de la lucha de clases, la conciencia tiende a tener elementos de homogeneidad.
When the formerly backward stratas raise up and catch and even sometimes overlap the vanguard,
Momentos en los que las capas más atrasadas quedan avance y alcanzan incluso a veces sobrepasan
and the presence of a working class revolutionary party can be the decisive element to bring this consciousness to the necessary level in order to face the historical task of the conquest of power.
momentos en los que la existencia de un partido revolucionario de la clase obrera puede ser decisivo o el elemento decisivo para que este cambio en la conciencia lleve a la tarea de poder.
But this is exception, because under capitalism, the normal condition is of much more dispersion, difference, and even conflicting tendencies inside the masses.
Estos momentos de lucha y de homogeneidad son una excepción. La norma es excepción, diferencias e incluso conflictos.
And it would be yet another sectarian mistake to believe that a vanguard organization can change this through mere propaganda or even through action. The revolutionary party or tendency in these epochs has the task of carefully analyze at every juncture, under any given circumstances, the state of the movement.
A cada momento, a cada diferente giro de los acontecimientos, el estado del movimiento y analizar y encontrar las tendencias progresistas de todas las
To spot those progressive tendencies that manifest themselves amongst the masses and try to connect to them in order to advance its cause.
Conectar con ellas y hacer avanzar la causa.
Sectarian or ultra-left groups did in fact play a role also in mass movements, as witnessed by the example of the 60s and 70s in several countries. Italy was one clear case, but not the only one. We could also refer to revolutionary events like the Cordobazo in Argentina in 1969 and many, many others. And in a very general way, we could say that most of the ultra-left tendencies in those years were originated amongst the students.
De manera general, podemos decir que muchas de estas tendencias progresistas de esta época nacieron entre.
And the radicalization of the youth from the second half of the 60s was certainly an anticipation of the process going on deep beneath the surface in society, inside the working class. It was like the radicalization of the Russian youth before 1905 revolution. And that was also fueled by international events. And in this sense, it was also distorted by the peculiar form that the colonial revolution took in the post-war period.
Particulares dado al proceso muy particular también que tomó la revolución colonial posterior a la Segunda Guerra.
The Chinese Revolution, and in particular the Cuban Revolution, the guerrilla liberation war in Vietnam, were seen by the revolutionary students as a new perspective for the revolution. And of course, the perspective of a peasant guerrilla could not appeal to the working class in Europe. And it led to tragic experiences under the form of a revival of terrorism at a later stage. But before that, that generation of students did actually play a role in the big movements, not only in the schools and universities, but in the working class too. There were also some cadres who had broken with the communist and socialist parties earlier, who played a leading part in those movements between 1968 and 69 in Italy. And for a short while, paradoxically, their sectarianism and their ultra-leftism gave them an advantage on the trade union bureaucracy.
50 minutes.
They maintained a lot of awfully wrong ideas and a wild spontaneism above all, but this found an audience in the big industrial plants. The most exploited layers of the working class, most of them of recent immigration from southern Italy, were suffering from low wages, discrimination inside and outside the workplaces, and savage exploitation on the assembly belt during the post-war boom.
Y estas capas es las que estaban más abiertas.
And they were largely neglected by the trade union bureaucracy and gave a good response to the students coming at the factory gates with the revolutionary propaganda.
Capas que estaban generalmente ignoradas por la burocracia sindical y que recibían la propaganda estudiantil revolucionaria de manera positiva.
And so they discussed jointly with the students their conditions, their demands, and what to do.
Discutieron conjuntamente con estos estudiantes sus condiciones de trabajo, demandas y cuáles eran los siguientes pasos.
And actually, there was a stage in 1968 when the ultra-left groups were in a position to command an important following and to call effective strikes in some of the biggest industrial plants in northern Italy.
Y de hecho, la etapa en el 68 en la cual los izquierdistas más estudiantil llegaron a tener una posición importante y eran capaces de hacer llamamientos a huelgas efectivas en algunas de las plantas industriales más importantes de Italia.
And the tragedy was that they did not have the theoretical arsenal to understand what they were in effect doing.
La tragedia de estas situaciones que no tenían el bagaje teórico para entender lo que estaban haciendo.
The unbroken thread, that is, the unbroken thread of Marxist theory was not present, and it had been cut previously, in particular by the role of Stalinism.
El hilo rojo del fascismo no estaba presente, había sido destruido por el papel de la Revolución.
Had they had a real Marxist grounding, history could have taken a different path. Because the ultra-left sects were in effect able to organize several thousands of young workers and students, maybe 30,000 as an overall figure at their peak. And the biggest groups had 5,000 to 8,000 each, which was a small force compared to 1.5 million or more in the Communist Party, but still could have played a different role. And with an adequate tactic towards the trade unions, the factory councils, and the Communist Party, they could have laid the basis for the building of a small revolutionary party. Just like the Ordine Nuovo group in Turin in 1919-1920 was able to win the best workers' vanguard in the factory councils, which later gave an important base in the working class to the newly formed Italian Communist Party in 1921. Unfortunately, the ultra-left in the late 60s did not possess that sort of theoretical armory. I'm not hearing the translation anymore.
No, sorry. Desafortunadamente, la izquierda a finales de los 60 no poseía este bagaje teórico.
They proclaimed the death of the trade unions. They boycotted the newly formed factory councils. They glorified the purely economic demands on wages as inherently revolutionary, and so on.
sin glorificar las demandas puramente económicas como las únicas realmente revolucionarias.
And so on. And so they facilitated the comeback of the trade union bureaucracy in the following stage.
Y así facilitaron la vuelta de la burocracia sindical más tarde.
In more recent years, there were other examples of the sectarian organizations acting as a sort of barometer of bigger events to come.
En años más cercanos hemos visto otros ejemplos de organizaciones sectarias que pueden ser vistas como barómetros de los acontecimientos que iban a llegar.
I have in mind the example of the Argentinazo of 2001, the insurrection that overthrew 5 presidents in a couple of weeks after the financial collapse of the country.
Por ejemplo, tengo en mente el Argentinazo, que hizo caer 5 presidentes en un par de semanas en Argentina.
That was a key link in the chain of revolutionary events, which in that decade spanned from Venezuela to Bolivia, Ecuador, and in one way or another touched most of the Latin American continent.
Es un elemento clave en la cadena de eventos revolucionarios que esta década voló sobre Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador y que de una manera u otra tocó a prácticamente todo el continente latinoamericano.
A few months before that explosion, the left, which in Argentina for historical reasons has always been composed by important sects, mainly with Trotskyist allegiance, had an unexpected result in the polls with an overall figure of 10% or so of the votes.
Algunos meses antes de dicha explosión, la izquierda, que en Argentina, por histórica, siempre ha tenido un componente importante de grupos sectarios, la mayoría de los cuales trotskistas, tuvo unos resultados sorprendentes en las elecciones, conjuntamente prácticamente un 10% de votos.
But as I said, it was mainly a symptom of a deeper process which expressed immediately after in a full-scale insurrection and a revolutionary situation.
Pero como digo, es fundamentalmente un síntoma de un proceso más profundo que de manera brutal se expresó a gran escala en una situación revolucionaria.
It is important to notice that despite this relatively important role, the sects in effect denied the perspective of a revolutionary, of a revolution and of workers' power.
Es importante que a pesar de que
60 minutes.
They relied on electoral tactics or cultivated their own points of support in very specific section of the masses. Like the unemployed of the piqueteros movement for the Partido Obrero, or some of the occupied factories for the PTS, which were 2 of the main groups.
Poco exclusivo por parte del Partido Obrero y del movimiento piquetero o el movimiento de fábricas ocupadas por parte del PTS que eran los 2 grupos.
Of course, it is absolutely correct to intervene energetically amongst those sections of the working class that display fighting ability. Our Brazilian section, for instance, has a proud record, a proud history of supporting and leading the struggle in occupied factories run by the workers themselves.
Brasileña tiene un historial honroso y muy importante de dirigir y apoyar la lucha de las fábricas ocupadas ellos mismos.
The mistake of the sects was in giving an absolute value to a specific movement, to figure it as the working class movement and the only one.
El error de las sectas fue de dar un valor absoluto a un movimiento específico y de definirlo como el movimiento obrero, el único que valía la pena intervenir.
The mistake to mistake the part for the whole, if you like, and that leads inevitably to mistakes of both ultra-left or opportunistic nature.
Si queréis, se puede decir que confundir una parte por el todo, y eso inevitablemente lleva a errores sectaristas o oportunistas, o los dos.
And that revolutionary situation gave rise to a discussion about the question of workers' power.
Esa situación
And Alan Wood's article that was included amongst the readings for this session deals precisely with that discussion. And while some groups like the PTS tended to minimize the scope of the movement, referred to it just as revolutionary days and not revolutionary situation. Others, like the Partido Obrero, spoke of a revolutionary situation, but did not draw the necessary strategy from that, and evaded the decisive point using the confused slogan of the Constituent Assembly. And in the following years, electoral policies and tactics became more and more dominant, leading to a serious problem of adaptation to the bourgeois state and of watering down of the program and subsequently to splits and crises in these groupings. The same contradiction between an advanced layer and the mass of the working class I referred to in relation to the early years of the Communist International can also emerge in an inverse form, if you like in a mirror in different circumstances. When a mass movement develops, it generates thousands or tens of thousands of new activists and new cadres. That is, people who overnightly embrace the active participation in the movement, joining its organization, people who are leaders of the masses. But when the movement begins to ebb, this layer will not necessarily be able to understand the change immediately and to act accordingly. The process is well explained in Trotsky's analysis of the 1905 revolution and is also dealt in details in Alan Wood's History of the Bolshevik Party. In 1906, 1907, the movement in Russia was retreating after the bloody suppression of the Moscow uprising. But while the masses were slowly retreating, a layer of the vanguard had drawn revolutionary conclusions from the experience of 1905 and joined the ranks of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, both the Menshevik and the Bolshevik wing. And this explains the fact that during the retreat, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party reached its peak membership as registered at the congresses of 1906 and 1907. This contradiction too gave rise to sectarian tendencies inside the Bolshevik faction, such as the boycott of the elections and a semi-terrorist deviation amongst a layer of the Bolshevik activists. Some of the leaders of these factions, like Bogdanov, always had some sectarian trait and theoretical differences with Lenin. But under the different conditions of 1904, 1905, these were not a real danger. But in the new situation, Lenin understood that the sectarian mistakes, combining with the negative turn of the objective situation, could be a mortal danger for the Bolshevik tendency. And condemning the Bolshevik could condemn the Bolshevik to a sectarian degeneration. And that is why, while previously Lenin tolerated them, although without making the slightest theoretical concession, now he went for a head-on clash.
70 minutes.
Yeah. And that included both a political battle, for instance, on the question of participation in the elections and legal activity in general, and also a theoretical backlash against the philosophical idealist tendencies which lied at the bottom of this ultra-left faction. We can say that in epochs of retreat and defeat, it is almost inevitable that part or even the majority of the revolutionary movement degenerate in sectarian forms, as it is just not possible to reach the masses. The fate of the Fourth International was set by the defeats of the late 30s and the 40s, which gave the reformists and the Stalinists an iron grip on the labor movement on a world scale and segregating the Marxists to the sidelines for a whole historical period. Well, when similar developments come about, there is room for all sorts of mistakes, notwithstanding the amount of Marxist phraseology and quotes which are written into political resolutions or leading articles on the party press.
Cuando eventos de este tipo llegan, todo
A key text that should be carefully studied by all comrades is the Program of the International, written by Ted Grant in 1970.
un texto clave
And that document carefully traces the theoretical roots of the degeneration of the Fourth International and its capitulation to the adverse historical forces.
documento que de manera cuidadosa pone a raíz de esta degeneración del
I'm not going further on that, as I think that the session on the history of the IMT will deal with it in depth.
No sigo en este tema porque la sesión sobre historia internacional tratará esto.
On a much smaller scale, the sectarian degeneration of the CWI in the mid and late 80s had some similar traits.
A nivel mucho más pequeño, pero partido, la degeneración sectaria de muy breve, la de los años 80 tenía algunos rasgos similares.
The general trend after the 70s was one of retreat of the working class internationally.
La tendencia general después de los años 70 de la retirada.
And in Britain, the militant had attracted thousands of dedicated fighters who had drawn conclusions from the 70s, particularly about the limits and betrayals of reformism and also of left reformism. Losing the translator again. But at the turn of the decade, the workers' movement began to suffer a series of important defeats, like the miners in Britain,
Al principio de la década siguiente, de los 80, el movimiento empezó a sufrir con una serie de derrotas, empezando primero por la huelga de mineros en los años 60.
or the Fiat workers in Italy in 1980, and
También la derrota de la Fiat en Italia en los 80.
the defeat of the left coalition government in France,
La derrota del gobierno de unidad de la izquierda a principios de los 80 en Francia también.
the defeat of the air traffic controllers strike in the US in 1981, and so on. There were many of these defeats, both on the economical and political front.
Hubo toda una serie de derrotas a nivel político y económico, por ejemplo en Estados Unidos, la huelga de los controladores aéreos del gobierno Reagan en el 81.
And that clashed with the previous experience. And so the contradiction expressed in the CWI and the militant, in the idea that you could advance in the same way under any objective circumstance by applying organizational pressure on the organization.
Así que esta serie de derrotas chocó con la experiencia de toda una serie de miembros de Militant que venían de una experiencia y la organización pensó que podía avanzar de la misma manera que había avanzado en la etapa precedente, simplemente aplicando más presión sobre la organización.
Now, retrospectively, we characterized that epoch as one of mild reaction. But even in epochs of retreat, the processes are not homogeneous. There will be cross currents.
Nosotros caracterizamos esa época como de reacción suave, pero even en el periodo de retirada, los procesos no son homogéneos y hay contracorriente.
In the mid-late 80s, the CWI was able to intervene and even to lead mass movements like the anti-poll tax movement in Great Britain or the students' movement in Spain in 1986-87. And while these were stunning successes, there was also a great danger entailed, which only later became apparent. Because it is all too easy in such circumstances to mistake one particular trend, which is moving forward, for the general and prevailing trend, which at the time was moving backwards, a mild reaction, as I said. For peculiar reasons, a small organization can find itself at the head of a mass movement, and of course it is duty-bound to fulfill its role as best as it can. But this does not mean that that position is won permanently, nor it means that that particular movement sets the main trend in society. Missing this point was one of the causes that contributed to the sectarian evolution of the CWI and had effects on a section of our Spanish cadres later on.
$80 minutes.
There were several other sides to that process I can't deal properly here, but one is worth quoting. Participation in mass organizations in itself is not a guarantee against sectarianism. The militant was a part of the Labour Party, but this did not prevent its sectarian evolution. In fact, the fact that it commanded the majority in the Labour Party Young Socialists at a certain point contributed to the bureaucratic tendencies which were linked to that method of administrative pressure I referred to. there was a certain layer of so-called cadres who had emerged mainly not from the participation in the movement and in the building of on the ground, nor for their political and theoretical contribution, but rather by advancing along internal lines in the organization. And that increased the tendency to an authoritarian method of leading, which proved to be a fatal weakness when a few years later the organization was not prepared to have a real debate facing the turn in the war situation in 1989 and 1991. And this sort of sectarianism had nothing progressive, nothing infantile in it. It was rather an ossification, and all the attempts to fight it through a serious internal debate proved futile, as the opposition led by Ted Grant, Alan Woods, and others was simply expelled in a few months. The parallel is with the splits that Grant had to cope with in the late 30s or in 1949 or in 1965 with the so-called Fourth International. And, despite Ted's persistent attempt to discuss and to overcome the differences with the principled debate, that was not possible. And in all those instances, the only way the Marxist tendency could survive and re-establish itself was through a split. But in all these historical examples, Ted's method, which we are to defend, was to debate and to defend the principles, amongst which the question of internal democracy was not the less important. That is the Leninist method, and it is important to notice that in 1906 Lenin was prepared to remain in a minority amongst the Bolsheviks, accepting the boycott of the elections, although he was against it. And even more noticeable, the fact that Lenin and Trotsky, on the eve, just before the Third Congress of the Communist International in 1921, contemplated the hypothesis to be in a minority, given the strength of the ultra-left tendencies of the German and Italian communist parties in particular.
Es incluso más remarcable el hecho de que Lenin y Trotsky en 1921, al alba del tercer Congreso de la Internacional Comunista, contemplaron la posibilidad de estar en minoría en ese Congreso, dada la fuerza de las tendencias ultraizquierdistas en el seno del Partido Comunista Alemán y del Partido Cristiano.
They were firmly convinced that discussion, even an internal fight, combined with experience, would show the correctness of their stand and overcome the sectarian mistakes.
Estaban totalmente convencidos de que una discusión abierta y compañera junto con los eventos que iban a suceder mostrarían la corrección de su posición sobre los errores
And I'm quoting these episodes for an important reason, because the IMT today is a homogeneous political organization, and this was won through discussion and theoretical training.
Cito estos ejemplos por una razón. La PMI hoy es una organización homogénea y esto es gracias a través de todo un periodo de discusiones y de formación política teórica.
But we have entered an epoch of catastrophic events, an epoch of unprecedented crisis of capitalism, of intense class struggle, of revolution and counter-revolution.
Pero hemos entrado en una época de eventos catastróficos,
And these events will test us too. We will have to face new problems, changes, sharp turns, and this will inevitably create differences and even conflicts, political conflicts.
estos eventos van a poner a prueba. Vamos a enfrentarnos a nuevos problemas, a cambios radicales, que sin ninguna duda van a llegar a diferencias, incluso a políticas diferencias, y tenemos que prepararnos para ello.
And not to think so would amount to embrace the wildest form of idealism and detachment from reality.
Y no hacerlo nos llevaría al más salvaje idealismo, alejamiento de la realidad y de la realidad que viene.
As materialists, we base our actions on the objective situation as we can understand it. We know that our program, our strategy do not come just from our desire.
Los idealistas pasamos a la situación objetiva tal como la entendemos. Sabemos que nuestro problema, nuestra estrategia no son nuestra elección, no son lo que queremos.
But this has nothing in common with a fatalistic optimism or a passive contemplation of an objective development.
Pero esto no tiene nada que ver con un fatalista, con un optimismo fatalista o
90 minutes.
la pasividad contemplativa del desarrollo objetivo.
A few more minutes, Eric, and I sum up.
Unos minutos más y termino.
The October Revolution was the result of the objective reality of the class struggle in Russia and on a world scale, but became a reality only through the will, the subjective action of the Bolshevik Party and its leadership.
La Revolución de Octubre es el resultado de la realidad objetiva de la lucha de clases en Rusia y a nivel internacional, pero solo se convirtió en una realidad objetiva a través de la voluntad, la acción subjetiva del Partido Bolchevique y de su dirección.
And in the same way, the building of a new revolutionary international is an objective necessity, but it is a subjective act which depends from the collective action of men and women who choose this endeavor.
De la misma manera, la construcción de una internacional revolucionaria es una necesidad objetiva, pero un acto subjetivo que depende de la acción colectiva de mujeres y hombres que eligen hacer esto.
I have not dealt with the conditions of the sectarian galaxy these days because the crisis is complete.
No he tratado las condiciones de crisis del galaxia sectaria, porque estos días su crisis es completa, se ha completado.
It is not by chance, it is part of the preparation of the world-shaking events that are in the making, and these groups are part of the past.
Esto no es una casualidad, es preparación de los eventos que van a cambiarlo todo. Estos grupos representan el pasado.
And the surest symptom of their crisis is that in many countries they try to join forces to build united fronts amongst them and so on.
Una de las síntomas de su crisis es su voluntad de construir frentes únicos, fusionarse y juntarse.
Our general relationship with that word is the same we had in 1938 or 1965.
Nuestra visión general, la relación con ellos debe ser la misma que hemos tenido en el 38 o en el 65.
Go your way till the end, gentlemen, and we will ignore you and face to the working class.
Vosotros a la vuestra, señores y señoras, os ignoramos y ya nosotros nos orientamos hacia la clase obrera.
We face the youth and the best representative of those millions, of those billions of people who are facing the decay and rottenness of capitalism and will fight to find a way out.
Los mejores representantes de esos millones, si no miles de millones de gente que se está enfrentando a la decadencia capitalista, buscando una salida.
There is a passage in the program of the International I mentioned by Ted Grant, which I think illustrates the relationship between those two elements, the subjective and the objective, in an unsurpassed way. This is my last point, Comrade Chair.
Ir terminando, hay un párrafo, documento que mencionó de Ted Grant del programa internacional que ilustra la relación de estos dos elementos, el subjetivo y el objetivo, de una manera brillante.
And I quote, the pressure of capitalism, reformism, and Stalinism in a period of capitalist upswing in the West the temporary consolidation of Stalinism in the East, the perversions of the colonial revolution as explained in the preceding material, of Stalinism. Were the causes of the degeneration of all the sects claiming to be the Fourth International. But an explanation is not an excuse, and necessity has two sides. In preceding history, the degeneration of the Second and the Third Internationals, due to objective as well as subjective factors, did not justify the leaders who had abandoned Marxism. It did not justify either reformism or Stalinism. Similarly, there is no justification for the crimes of sectarianism and opportunism which had been committed by the leaders of the so-called Fourth International for more than an entire generation. And Comrade Ted Grant was never afraid of calling things by their right name. Already in the 40s, he referred to the sections of the Fourth International as small sects. And at that time, that included the RCP, of which he himself was the main political leader and theoretician. It was a sharp way to warn of the danger that even promising revolutionary organizations can fall into the blind alley of sectarianism and being lost for their historical task. And today, this gigantic task lies before us. The historical trend is once again moving forward. And we must therefore assume full responsibility for that. And I'm sure that this discussion and this school as a whole will be an important step. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, Claudio, for this very clarifying lead-off. Traducción. We will pause now for 19 minutes. We'll reconvene at 8:30 European time or 7:30 British time. Okay, here we are again. We start a discussion. Just a reminder, this is a session on Marxism versus sectarianism. We just heard Claudio Bellotti. Before Erica from the section of the United States speaks, one announcement. Is if you want to read more about the tradition, the Marxist tradition and its struggle against ultra-leftism and sectarianism, we advise you to read Lenin's excellent book on the infantile disorder called left-wing communism. You can buy it straight directly on our website of the publishing house of In Defense of Marxism called Well-Reads. Now Erica from the United States will speak. She will be followed by Joel from the Canadian section. First, give her possibility to speak, which is important. I think you're active now. Erica, you can speak.
Thank you, Claudio, for introducing this topic. I agree this discussion cannot be about merely naming characteristics of sectarianism. The historical examples Claudio gave are important to study. The political organizations and parties which made sectarian mistakes also have many positive lessons we can learn from. We are focusing on the mistakes in this discussion in hopes of avoiding them ourselves. The Bolsheviks also made sectarian mistakes. The party, which was new and more accustomed to small circle propaganda work, did not want to get involved in the apolitical Soviets which had emerged in 1905. Only after Lenin's repeated intervention from abroad did they reluctantly try to appeal to the workers in the Soviets. But by then it was too late. There was no trust built between the Russian socialists and the workers and peasants in the Soviets. The Bolsheviks would often get kicked out of the Soviet meetings or not allowed to speak. They had cut themselves off from the masses, from the very working class to which they had sworn to lead and serve. This is the consequence of sectarianism. The Bolsheviks, thanks to Lenin, were able to overcome and correct this mistake. We do not shut ourselves off from the revolutionary people, Lenin said. But submit to their judgment every step and every decision we take. Several years and revolutions later, he was able to advise young communists in Germany and Britain. About the dangers of the sectarian approach in left-wing communism and infantile disorder. In particular, he argued against the developing tendency in young communists to abstain from electoral politics altogether. They were arguing that parliamentarianism or bourgeois democracy is politically obsolete.
5 minutes already.
And to participate in it would be to become opportunists or corrupt themselves. We understand that we will not be able to simply vote away private property and capitalism. A revolution is necessary. And in this sense, communists understand bourgeois democracy as historically obsolete. But it has not yet proved itself to be obsolete to the entire working class. Lenin says, whilst you lack the strength to do away with bourgeois parliament and every other type of reactionary institution, you must work within them because it is there that you will still find workers. In other words, if you cannot yet offer the workers anything better, you must use the same institutions through which the working class channels their energy. The institutions which presently actually exist, not the perfect mass revolutionary party which only exists in the mind of the sectarian. Lenin directly advised the young British comrades to call on the workers to vote for Labour against bourgeois parties. To use this election in 1920 as a platform to put forward a revolutionary program. But how do we apply this advice in the USA, a highly developed country with still no Labour Party? The absence of a Labor Party in the US does not mean that the working class has no illusions in electoral politics. They do not see electoral politics or bourgeois democracy as politically obsolete. In the US, there exists a vacuum in political leadership for the working class, but nature abhors a vacuum. The movement around Bernie Sanders, which first emerged in 2016, came out of this vacuum. Yesterday, Jorge Martin talked about the radicalization of younger generations who came of age during or after the 2008 economic crisis. Who have only known instability, austerity, impending climate catastrophe, and seen mass movement after mass movement. This is the context in which the movement around Bernie Sanders emerged. His program offered reforms American workers desperately needed. A public healthcare system, free education, reforms that at this stage capitalism cannot provide even in the richest country in the world.
Ten minutes.
We needed to connect to the working class at the level of consciousness it had reached. However, to encourage any illusions that the working class could win these reforms by working in a capitalist party would be a mistake and a lie. We engaged with Sanders supporters at rallies, events, expressing our support for these reforms. And we called for reforms that went farther than Sanders was willing to go. We also explained why Sanders running as a Democrat crippled the struggle for these basic reforms. We did not compromise on the idea that the workers need political independence from the bourgeoisie. The day Sanders announced that he was suspending his campaign, we got over 100 submissions to our website. The method we used in order to arrive at this orientation to the Sanders movement was the transitional method.
13 minutes, 2 minutes left.
Transitional. The transitional method is the result of applying Marxist philosophy, dialectical materialism, to the concrete task of building a revolutionary party. The transitional method is the result of applying Marxist philosophy, dialectical materialism, to the concrete task of building a revolutionary party. I will wrap up since I only have a little bit of time left. Dialectical materialism is the philosophy of change, as the working class is not a monolith and develops non-linearly. Sectarianism finds itself disconnected from the living, ever-evolving working class because it does not base itself in dialectical materialism. It is one thing to quote Lenin, and it is another to apply the same method to different conditions. We are here to study the ideas and the method of Marxism to lead the working class to fulfill its historical role. And we are here to arm ourselves against any method which undermines this effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erica. The next speaker will be Joel from the Canadian section. I'll activate his mic and also Joel, you can speak now.
Hello.
After translation.
Cool. Well, thank you, Eric. Thank you, Claudio, for the great presentation. I think this question of sectarianism and sectarian attitudes is very important for Marxists today. Because if we look at the Marxist movement and Marxist organizations, they have never been so disconnected from the masses. That if you went back 100 years, or even less in many countries, there was an organic link with Marxism and the masses, or at least the advanced guard of the masses. That most people in the labor movement, at least the activists, would have been some form of Marxist or socialist or revolutionary. But this link has been severed for many reasons. Marxist groups are, generally speaking, small circles, small study circles on the margins, on the edge of the movement. And it's been this way for some time. And this is important to note because this situation comes with dangers. That being isolated from the masses for an extended period of time, you can develop sectarian prejudices. And actually be hostile to the real development of the working class. Because it doesn't fit exactly with what you read in a book, for example. This was the case with the Bolsheviks in Russia, actually, as Erica mentioned. Who actually demanded that the Soviets in 1905 submit themselves to the party. And you see modern examples of this attitude in, I think, most Marxist groups or Marxist attitudes toward the Jeremy Corbyn phenomenon in Britain. Claudio mentioned the CWI. Which in Britain basically refused to join and participate in this process. Which is a process of millions of people. Which we obviously have our criticisms of Jeremy Corbyn. But to refuse to join the Labour Party at this time and support and actively be engaged with the Corbyn supporters is just sectarianism. So Marx famously said that the emancipation of the working class must be the work of the working class itself. But the working class doesn't come onto the scene politically spontaneously with a perfect Marxist program. But comes to those conclusions through a long and painful struggle. Trying out this or that leader or party. It's been mentioned, Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, Syriza, Friends and Sumis. And overall, the masses don't learn from reading Marxist theory like we do. But they learn through experience.
5 minutes.
So many people now, I'd say millions of people, have learned the limits of reformism. But not because revolutionaries denounced these people. But through the actual experience of reformism. Erica mentioned Bernie Sanders. The betrayal of Bernie Sanders twice now. And in Britain, Jeremy Corbyn's refusal to fight the right reformists. Which has led to the situation we have now in Britain. But I think we will see many formations similar to the ones mentioned. Which don't have a perfect Marxist program for us. But are expressions of this mass discontent of the working class. And we cannot simply reject these out of hand, as many people do. We must seek for a way to connect the advanced revolutionary conclusions of Marxism with this process of development of the consciousness of the masses. Which is inherently contradictory. Without a flexible approach, a successful revolution is actually not possible. Because the sectarian, non-flexible approach rejects the process of development of the consciousness of the masses. Which effectively makes Marxist ideas unable to reach the masses. So to sum up a bit of what I think our approach is, so we don't do what sectarians do and mistake our consciousness for the consciousness of the mass of workers. We don't get frustrated that most workers don't agree with Marxism.
10 minutes.
Which is actually quite common on the left. But if you're actually a Marxist, you would say, of course they don't agree with Marxism yet. Because Marxist conclusions are hard to swallow and people don't arrive at them overnight. So as Lenin said, we must patiently explain. As we have been patiently explaining that it was a mistake that Bernie Sanders was in the Democratic Party. And we patiently explained all of the errors that Corbyn was making. So we must develop a flexible approach without abandoning our principles. Because that would be the other danger, which is opportunism. So we must find a way to connect with the masses, their movements, their organizations, as they come into being, change, and evolve. As the masses learn, and we should be confident and optimistic, because we have the benefit of Marxist theory,
13 minutes.
which helps us see which way things are going. So we can be confident that the events will prove correct our perspective. And the masses will come to our side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel. The next speaker will be Kaspar. He's a comrade from Switzerland. Give me time to reactivate his mic.
Okay, you hear me? I'll do what Claudio said we shouldn't do. I'll try to make a list of the differences between Marxism and sectarianism. Because I think it helps me to get it to think about it in a clearer way. I think a first difference is that we Marxists, we have an unabridged faith in the possibility of consciousness to change on a mass scale in the relatively near future.
La primera diferencia sería que nosotros los marxistas tenemos una fe íntegra en la posibilidad de que la conciencia de las masas cambie a una escala masiva en el futuro próximo.
We live in a period, in a moment when people realize that they can't continue live like they did before.
Vivimos en un momento que la gente se está dando cuenta que no puede seguir viviendo como lo han hecho antes.
And people don't change habits and ideas easily or voluntarily, and I include myself in this.
Las personas no cambian sus hábitos y sus ideas de manera fácil y voluntaria, incluyéndome a mí.
But the crisis forces people to do that.
Pero la crisis obliga a las personas a hacer esto.
I live in Switzerland, and there's a reason why people here still have illusions in capitalism and the whole regime. Some illusions.
Yo vivo en Suiza y hay una razón por la cual las personas aquí todavía tienen algunas ilusiones en el capitalismo y el régimen en general.
Because the system could give them a more or less stable life for a certain period.
Porque el sistema les permitía tener una vida estable, al menos por un cierto periodo.
But Switzerland is not isolated from world capitalism, and so the same processes are at work here, just a little bit delayed.
Suiza no está aislada del capitalismo mundial. Entonces, los mismos procesos también están llevándose a cabo aquí, solamente que con cierto retraso.
And if you have been to only one solidarity demonstration with the Black Lives Matter movement, you see that you feel that consciousness has already made a huge leap, especially with the youth.
Y si has estado en alguna manifestación de solidaridad con el movimiento Black Lives Matter, las vidas negras importan, puedes ver que esa conciencia ha dado ya un gran salto, especialmente de la gente joven.
And this is only the beginning.
Y este es solo el comienzo.
And it's the perspective of massive changes in the near future and the potential for revolutionary ideas that is the main difference between Marxists and sectarians today.
Y es esta perspectiva de cambios masivos en el futuro próximo y en el potencial de las ideas revolucionarias, lo que es una diferencia o forma la diferencia principal entre los marxistas y los sectarios.
The second difference, I think, is that it's the huge events that people experience around the world that is destroying the old ideas. It's not thanks to us.
La segunda diferencia es que son los grandes eventos que las personas están experimentando en todo el mundo lo que destruye las viejas ideas, no somos nosotros.
And these ideas get smashed because they don't correspond to the world we live in today.
Estas ideas son aplastadas porque no corresponden con el mundo en que vivimos hoy.
And this is mostly an objective process that happens independently of us and is not in our control.
Esto entonces es principalmente un proceso objetivo que sucede independientemente de nosotros y está fuera de nuestro control.
But the central question is actually, what do these ideas get replaced with and how fast?
Pero la pregunta central es, ¿qué se reemplazan estas ideas y qué tan rápido?
This is our job and our responsibility, and I think this is the main discussion we're having here.
Este es nuestro trabajo y nuestra responsabilidad y de hecho de esto se trata esta discusión.
The third difference is that sectarians have a static view of the relationship of forces, and we try to have, or we have, a dynamic one.
The third difference is that sectarians have a static view.
We make the same observation sometimes, for example, that today most people aren't revolutionaries yet.
Los sectarios tienen una visión estática de la relación de fuerzas, mientras que la nuestra es dinámica, y nosotros hacemos la misma observación hoy.
And this observation that not all people are revolutionaries, it's true, but it's not the whole picture.
Esta observación que la mayoría de personas hoy no son revolucionarias es cierta, es correcta, pero no presenta todo el panorama.
Because the decisive feature of our epoch is that new layers get drawn into the fight and get politicized and draw radical conclusions on a daily basis.
Porque la característica decisiva de nuestra época es que nuevas capas se van involucrando en la lucha, se van politizando y van sacando conclusiones radicales a diario.
And so consciousness will change exponentially and not gradually. And this is our chance.
Y por lo tanto, la conciencia cambiará exponencialmente y no gradualmente. Y esta es nuestra oportunidad.
But the question is how to prepare.
La pregunta es cómo prepararnos.
And one main question is, what do we do with the advanced layers, the ones who arrive at revolutionary conclusions first?
Y la pregunta es qué hacer con las capas avanzadas, las que sacan conclusiones revolucionarias primero.
Should they substitute the masses because they arrived at these conclusions first, or should they turn towards the masses?
¿Deberían sustituir a las masas por haber llegado a estas conclusiones primero o deberían orientarse hacia las masas?
And I think one main point is that only because the advanced layers have already understood something, for example, that parliament is a useless institution in our fight,
y un punto, el que las secciones avanzadas hayan alcanzado conclusiones correctas primero, por ejemplo, con el parlamentarismo.
we should not give in to their radicalism, because this would be opportunism.
No debemos simplemente ceder ante su radicalismo, ya que esto sería oportunismo.
But we must explain to them that behind them are thousands who are on the same track, on the way to discover the same truth, but who have not yet arrived there.
Pero debemos explicarles que detrás de ellos hay miles que ya vienen en esta dirección para descubrir estas verdades, pero que aún no han llegado.
And an important part of the process when radical ideas reach the whole masses.
Y una importante parte del proceso cuando estas ideas empiezan a alcanzar a llegar a las masas.
Is that the advanced layer must orient to the rest, to the second layer or the masses, and make sure that they come at to the same conclusions as fast as possible.
Una parte importante del proceso es que la capa avanzada se oriente hacia las demás capas que van alcanzando las conclusiones revolucionarias y se aseguren de que lleguen a estas conclusiones lo más rápido posible.
And for this, they should not isolate themselves, which is a real risk, as Claudio explained, for example, with the small unions.
Pero esto significa que no se deberían aislar ellos mismos, como explicó Claudio con el ejemplo, por ejemplo, de las uniones izquierda.
And the fifth difference is the consciousness that workers in struggle actually often come to the same conclusions as Marxists, but from another angle.
Y el siguiente punto es que los trabajadores, mediante la lucha, llegan muchas veces a las mismas conclusiones que los marxistas, solamente de otro ángulo.
As Joel said, they don't learn from books and theory, but from experience which is often painful and cruel.
Como dijo Joel, no se aprende de libros y teorías, sino de la propia experiencia, que a menudo es dolorosa y cruel.
And so they can and do draw revolutionary conclusions from their experience, but this takes a lot of time.
10 minutes.
Sí pueden y de hecho sacan conclusiones revolucionarias y lo hacen al final, pero esto toma tiempo.
And to speed up this process is one of the main reasons for the existence of a revolutionary party.
Y el acelerar este proceso es la razón principal de la existencia de un partido revolucionario.
That we defend openly a revolutionary program.
Que defendamos abiertamente un programa revolucionario.
A program that actually is just the accumulated experience of the working class for the last 200 years.
Un programa que es simplemente la experiencia acumulada de la clase trabajadora de los últimos 200 años.
And the way we defend this program shows a difference in approach.
Y la manera en que defendemos este programa demuestra la diferencia en actitud.
Because the slogans and demands with which we intervene in struggles or strikes or political fights, these aren't ready-made, finished recipes for struggle.
Porque las exigencias que avanzamos nosotros dentro de los procesos de lucha no son exigencias acabadas.
In our approach, we apply the method of transitional program, as Erika explained.
En nuestro enfoque, nosotros aplicamos el proceso de las demandas transicionales, como Erika explicó.
We do propose slogans and demands to help a struggle.
Sí, planteamos consignas y demandas la lucha.
But we need to prove that these demands and these slogans are efficient and useful. And with this, we prove also the usefulness of Marxism.
Pero tenemos que probar que estas consignas y demandas son efectivas y útiles, y así probamos la utilidad del marxismo.
But we're not economists or syndicalists. We don't want just to help out because we're friendly.
Pero no somos economistas o sindicalistas, no queremos simplemente ayudar por ser amigables.
This would actually be opportunist.
Esto de hecho sería oportunista.
We always draw the attention to the limits of partial struggles that at best can win partial temporary victories.
Siempre llamamos la atención
13 minutes, 2 minutes
hacia
left.
los límites componentes de las luchas parciales, las cuales pueden, el mejor resultados, ganar solamente victorias parciales y temporales.
But we don't do this in an arrogant way, not with the aim to demoralize. This is a fine line to sectarianism.
No hacemos esto de una manera arrogante, no es para desmoralizar. Esta es la línea delgada del sectarismo.
But we're always honest and we tell the truth, that is that under capitalism, there are no lasting solutions for our problem.
Siempre somos honestos y decimos la verdad, que bajo el capitalismo no hay soluciones duraderas para nuestros problemas.
And I think a fifth difference is that the focus we put on education in Marxist theory and method.
Y creo que otra diferencia sería el enfoque en la educación, en el método de la teoría marxista.
Because for us, it's not enough to be on the left or to unite everybody together.
Porque para nosotros no es suficiente solamente estar en la izquierda o unirnos todos.
If we want a real unity, a stable and powerful unity, we need to unite on a set number of ideas and principles.
Si queremos una unidad verdadera, una unidad estable y poderosa, necesitamos unirnos alrededor de cierto conjunto de ideas y principios.
Otherwise, it's an opportunist unity that breaks down at the first onslaught.
De lo contrario, es una unidad oportunista que se rompe el primer ataque.
So if we staunchly defend our program, it's because we're proud to have a program and to have a method.
Así que si defendemos firmemente nuestro programa es porque estamos orgullosos de tener un programa, de tener un método.
To have a set of ideas that can give real answers to the most pressing problems of humanity.
Es tener un conjunto de ideas que pueden dar respuestas a los problemas más serios que enfrenta la humanidad.
Opportunists of all shades, including sectarians, call this principled stance sectarianism because we defend our program.
Los oportunistas de toda índole, incluidos los sectarios, llaman a esta posición de principios sectarismo.
But it is not, it is political honesty.
Pero no lo es honestidad política.
And for a sixth difference, in Switzerland, the main hobby of sectarians is to burn and vandalize bank offices at the back of the demo from a minority position.
La diferencia número 6, por ejemplo, en Suiza, el principal pasatiempo de los sectarios es destruir, vandalizar oficinas bancarias en la retaguardia de una demostración desde una posición minoritaria.
And we don't criticize this from a moral standpoint, but from a standpoint of method.
No los criticamos de un punto de vista moral, pero de un punto de vista de método.
Banks are our class enemies, or the bankers.
Los bancos o los banqueros son nuestros enemigos de clase.
But it's actually not true that the Swiss workers don't understand that.
Pero en realidad no es cierto que los trabajadores suizos no entiendan esto.
Especially after 2008, and maybe for the first time, bankers were not seen as a national pride anymore in Switzerland, but as something despicable.
Después del 2008, tal vez por primera vez, los banqueros ya no eran vistos como un orgullo nacional, pero como algo despreciable en Suiza.
So I say Marxists are not in the business of vandalizing bank offices, especially not the Swiss Marxists.
Así que digo que los marxistas no estamos en el negocio de destruir o vandalizar oficinas bancarias, especialmente los marxistas suizos.
We know that our historic task is to expropriate these banks.
Sabemos que nuestra tarea histórica es expropiar a estos bancos.
And to give back the stolen profits and super profits to the workers of all the countries where the money comes from.
Y devolver todas las ganancias y superganancias robadas de los trabajadores de todos los países de donde proviene este dinero.
And this is not only a necessary but a realist task.
Y esto no solamente necesario, pero es la tarea del realista.
But it's not for us, it's not for our organization alone to accomplish this as a substitute for the class.
Pero no es para nosotros, para nuestra organización por sí sola, hacer esto sustituyendo a la clase.
And it's only the Swiss working class that can and will do this.
Es solamente la clase obrera suiza que puede y debe hacer esto.
But for this, the conscious need for revolution, Marxism needs to find a road to the Swiss workers.
Pero para esto, las ideas conscientes del marxismo necesitan llegar a alcanzar la conciencia de los trabajadores suizos.
And to accomplish this, we need to avoid sectarianism or opportunism.
Y para lograr esto necesitamos evitar el sectarismo al igual que el oportunismo.
And that's what we dedicate all our work into. And if we accomplish it, nothing can stop us.
Y a eso es lo que dedicamos nuestro trabajo. Y si lo hacemos, nada nos puede detener.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Caspar. The next speaker will be Pedro from Brazil. He will be followed.
Hello, comrades. Thank you for the high-level discussion.
Not yet, Pedro.
Okay.
Right.
Can I?
Not yet. Wait a second. There's a problem here. Oh, Pedro, where are you? I lost you. Wait a second. Where are you? Wait a second, where are you? Oh yeah, there you are. Wait a second. Here you go. You can go. You can start. He's muted. He's still muted. Why is he muted? Wait a second again. My computer, which is
Hello? Let's
sorry
go.
for them. Yeah, here you can go.
Hello, comrades. Thank you for the high-level discussions. That's cool. I've been learning a lot. Well, Lenin proposal, writing in What Be Done, was that a Marxist party should help from within the workers' movement. To bring the socialist consciousness to the class struggle. But how to do it? And one step forward, two step back, 2 years before. He said the party had to delimit its boundaries. Boundaries between what would be itself and what would be the working class as a whole. This certainly did not mean separating itself from the working class movement. Like the illuminated ones. But whether it means to create a combat and a professional organism. Capable to help workers to seize political power in a favorable moment. The history proved Lenin was right. The workers cannot seize the power alone without socialist consciousness. Therefore, the party of the vanguard proletariat. However, Lenin's proposal was denied by the new reformists. Who emerged after a bankruptcy of social democracy and also by the ultra-leftists. Along the 20th century, all over the world, the leadership of the parties of the parties with thousands of workers inside accepted all kinds of bourgeois ideas and reivindications. They defended the existence of new vanguard, said that the working class is no longer the same. And said, we cannot repeat formulas of the past, and so on. A lot of them enjoyed in recent days in the Progressive International. Headed by Bernie Sanders and Ioannis. The ideological boundaries between the vanguard workers and the bourgeois was destroyed. On the other hand, the reformists took advantage in their propaganda of the emergence of various political organizations that behaving like sects. Self-proclaiming the truly fourth internationals, the truly world parties of the revolution.
5 minutes already.
And waiting the masses to understand who is the truly leadership. But the leadership of working class only can forge itself in the fight. The leftists, instead of being the most conscious part of the workers' movement, ao invés de serem a parte mais consciente do movimento operário, started highlight itself in the movement as its most revolutionary part. Being the most revolutionary party of the workers' movement was not what Marx advocated in his fight. The international Marxist tendency must patiently continue to feed a spirit of party. Where each comrade inside must act as part of a combat and professionalized organization.
Cada compañero debe comportarse como parte de una organización donde cada uno es un revolucionario profesional.
With the aim of intervening inside the workers' movement.
Con el objetivo de intervenir
Bringing socialist
en el seno del movimiento obrero.
But not separating the communists from the movement as a whole. Like Marx's words, I will read now. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand, practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country. That section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, they have over the great mass of the proletariat theoretically the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions and the ultimate general results of the proletariat movement. Thank you, comrades. Long life to the IMT and the working class movement. Death to the capital, its government and defenders.
Thank you, Pedro. I will ask Claudio now to give the closing remarks.
Gracias, Pedro. Le pediré a Claudio que responda y cierre la discusión.
Claudio.
Thank you, Eric. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and
Gracias,
clear.
Eric.
Okay.
¿Me oís?
Thank you very much to all the comrades who contributed to this discussion.
Muchas gracias a todas las contribuciones del debate.
I must say that the the condition of most of the sectarian groups and organizations, I would say all around the world, maybe there are exceptions, but I don't know important exception, is really unprecedented, is an unprecedented crisis.
Diría que a nivel global, las condiciones de todos los grupos sectarios, hay alguna excepción que yo no conozca, pero la regla es que están en crisis, una crisis sin precedentes.
30 years ago, when I joined the movement, or 40 years ago, a sectarian was, an ultra-left was mainly a young student or a young activist, impatient, calling for revolution every day, and maybe clashing with more experienced, older, or even skeptic workers, maybe linked to the Communist or Socialist Party.
Hace 30, 40 años, cuando el movimiento, un sectarianista izquierdista, era un joven estudiante, activo, activista, que entraba en contradicción con la vieja capa de militantes socialistas o comunistas y que pedía la revolución de manera inmediata.
And most of them were very active, very energetic. Maybe they burned out their energy in a short space of time, but they were always present.
La mayoría eran activos, energéticos, gastaban mucha energía al principio, se estaban quemando, pero ahí estaban presentes en la situación.
If I look around today, most of the sects, not to say all of them, are old organizations of old demoralized people whose main activity is to find excuses to do nothing. This is certainly the case in Italy, but I'm sure that in most of the countries the Congress could confirm this.
Hoy a mi alrededor, la mayoría de estas organizaciones hoy tienen viejos militantes desmoralizados cuyo mayor actividad es buscar excusas para no hacer nada. Es sin duda el caso en Italia, pero estoy seguro que los camaradas podrán encontrar cierta verdad en esto en otros países.
And far from preaching revolution next Monday, 8 o'clock in the morning, they all are very well versed in the argument to explain why revolution is not possible, neither today, nor next Monday, nor next year.
Y lejos de pedir la revolución para mañana lunes a las 8 de la mañana, están preparados en el argumentario de por qué la revolución no es posible ni hoy, ni mañana, ni la semana que viene, ni la año que viene.
And in this sense, they are absolutely on the same ground as the bureaucracy, in this skepticism and in this complete mistrust in the working class and in the class struggle.
Y en ese sentido están exactamente del mismo, a pie de igualdad con la burocracia, en la falta de confianza en las clases obrera y en la clase.
So when Comrade Hamid called me a couple of months ago or 1 month ago, asking me whether I could prepare this discussion, I thought I did something bad. I was going to be punished to deal with such a sorry subject. I can't hear the translation.
Hace un par de meses Hamid me preguntó si podía preparar esta discusión y me pensé, me está castigando para tratar un tema tan deprimente.
And in this sense, I think there is a parallel, also more on a general plane, with the situation I referred to of 1938 when with Ted Grant and the Fourth International.
Y en ese sentido creo que hay un paralelo con la situación en 1938 cuando se funda la Cuarta Internacional.
If the comrades read the very good book, the History of British Trotskyism and the related political documents of those years,
Los camaradas leen un libro muy bueno de la historia del trotskismo británico y los documentos políticos relacionados con esta situación
they will see that at that time in Great Britain, all the different Trotskyist groups merged in order to become the official section of the Fourth International in Great Britain.
Podrán ver que en ese momento todos los grupos trotskistas en el Reino Unido se fusionan para tener una organización unificada trotskista de cara al Congreso Nacional, de la Corte Nacional.
But since the fusion was completely unprincipled, Ted Grant and a very small group, maybe 30 comrades, refused to participate. They were prepared to be in a minority, provided that the fusion was principled on clear positions that could be challenged and discussed in the following stage. But since it was a very rotten compromise, they stayed outside. And in the space of 3 or 4 years, the history showed that the Workers' International League, that was the name that of the group that Ted Grant and Jock Huston and Ralph Lee were leading, became the strongest organization in the Trotskyist movement at that time in Britain, while all the other groups collapsed. Where is the parallel with today? First of all, these sects were based upon the old generation mainly, and Trotsky himself explained that a generation who is defeated is doomed, if you like. It is defeated in the class struggle, and also the organizations that that generation built upon its own shoulders will collapse or will degenerate anyway. And that was the case of all these groups.
No jugando ese papel, y esto es uno de los elementos.
Second, and this is very much relevant today, all the reformist organizations were completely mixed with the national government because of the war, with the national coalition, and their internal life was completely destroyed. There was no life whatsoever because of the war, again. And so there was no mass environment to work into for revolutionaries.
Segundo paralelismo, quizá el más útil para nosotros en esa época, todas las organizaciones reformistas estaban metidas en procesos de gobierno nacional, de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, y no había ningún tipo de vida interna.
And that involved also the trade unions, by the way. Thirdly, there was an enormous pressure on the working class because of the war and the crisis. And this is the case again today, of course, in different conditions for different reasons. And so there was a wide gap between what the working class was experiencing and the absolute impossibility to express this experience and its struggle through the mass organizations, the trade unions, the Labour Party in that case, and so on, and the absolute need for revolutionaries to find their own way to the crisis. Of course, they knew, Ted Grant knew, and his comrades, that they were a very small organization, that they couldn't lead the masses, they couldn't even reach the mass of the working class. But nevertheless, they systematically worked towards different industries, towards different areas of the country, with the aim of establish first roots and first links with the working class.
10 minutes.
Pero, a pesar de eso, sistemáticamente hubo un trabajo de organización, más activas y pasar a un
When they reached a certain strength and even were able to absorb some of the remnants of the other groups, they decided to call themselves a party, although they had, I think, 600 or 800 members, active members, and several thousand sympathizers.
Cuando llegaron a una cierta tamaño, una cierta fuerza y absorbieron lo que quedaba de esa fusión unitaria que mencionaba antes, decidieron llamarse un partido. De 600 y 800 miembros, varios miles de simpatizantes y a partido.
And so despite being such a small force, they correctly understood their task of that day, of that stage. And in the sense, they were sectarian towards the sects, and they were not sectarians towards the class.
Y entendieron que su tamaño había que tomar esas medidas, y de hecho lo que fueron sectarios hacia las sectas, no sectarios hacia las masas.
And of course, there are a lot of differences with that stage, and this is not a perspective discussion, but certainly the main difference is the demise and the defeat of Stalinism internationally, which at that time was a very strong obstacle.
Sobre el futuro del stalinismo y su rol, voy a hacer un paralelismo directo con la situación.
And reformism also today is is moving on a very shaky ground, on very thin ice, the reformist bureaucracy, particularly the left reformists. So I would say that today the danger of sectarianism doesn't come for us and for the movement in general from these leftovers of the old left and the ultra-left organizations, which are really no more than an appendix of the reformist bureaucracies. They just pander to these bureaucracies, try to find some room, some place here and there.
Y de hecho, diría que el peligro del sectarismo no viene por los restos de las instituciones reformistas de la izquierda, hoy día estas son apéndices de la burocracia, más, no viene de ahí.
I think that most serious discussion we could have about the danger of, at a certain stage, of impatient mood and maybe some adventurous trends in mass movement like Black Lives Matter, or maybe in Chile or other countries which experienced recently insurrectionary situations.
Creo que la discusión más seria en ese sentido sobre tendencias de movimiento del populismo, como Black Lives Matter o el movimiento en Chile, que ha llegado a momentos nacionalistas y una etapa mucho por delante.
I can guess that since this movement cannot achieve a victory in a short space of time, maybe in some layers it could be developed at a certain stage some adventurous trend. And that's why I refer to the sort of healthy sectarianism. I mean that ultra-left moods which come out from genuine fighters and genuine movements.
Puedo ver que, dado a que no hay una posibilidad de las capas más avanzadas, pues bueno, tendría un sentimiento de frustración. Esto se le puede llamar sectarianismo sano, tendencias izquierdistas que tienen una base en la voluntad de ir más allá, un debate útil.
But precisely because it's genuine, it's also dangerous because it is related to the real movement and can lead to serious mistakes. So we must identify and engage these tendencies when they present themselves on the scene.
Precisamente porque son genuinas, son peligrosas, porque son tendencias que tienen raíces en el movimiento y cuando aparecen debemos discutir y tratar con ellas de manera honesta para ganarlos y para evitar errores.
And in this sense, I must say that one of the most important counterweights to the danger of sectarian tendencies or ultra-left tendencies for us too is a systematic work towards the working class, towards the factories, the workplaces, the trade unions also, although I must stress that going to the working class doesn't mean just to go to the trade unions today.
Remarcar que no siempre el trabajo de los sindicatos quiere decir el trabajo de la clase obrera.
But we certainly must take on board the rule of the Communist International that a communist organization must strive systematically to establish points of support in the economic organization of the working class, that is the trade unions, to be recognized as a legitimate part of that movement and a voice to be heard. And during the pandemic, we experienced in Italy, but I'm sure again that this is also the experience of other comrades, that in the workplaces, every comrade, any comrade, could find an audience amongst his or her colleagues, discussing the question of security, of the lockdown, how to deal with the health, the danger for the health of the working class, and so on. Any comrade, even the less trained, you didn't need to be a shop steward, a political cadre. You could just speak out our position and get an audience.
Vieron durante la pandemia en los centros de trabajo, las fábricas, los compañeros tenían una audiencia. No hace falta ser el compañero más políticamente desarrollado, un cuadro, un dirigente sindical, sindicalista, sino cualquiera que ponía delante de las ideas de la organización tenía un eco entre una capa de sus compañeros de trabajo.
And precisely oh, there is a feedback. Precisely in these conditions, someone has a microphone, an open microphone, which comes back to my ears. And precisely in these conditions, we saw that handing over, I mean, giving the responsibility to all these comrades to act and to discuss amongst themselves was a great tool, a great lever, not only to build our forces, but also to raise the general political level, and to ensure that all of our debates were very closely linked to the real mood in the class, and not to be distorted or deviated by subjective ideas or ideas elaborated in our closed flats, where most of us were closed due to the lockdown.
20 minutes, Claudio.
Sino también discutir, aumentar el nivel de debate en los centros de trabajo, pero también en el seno de la organización. Tener el pulso en la sociedad y no tener simplemente discusiones creadas en apartamentos que estábamos confinados, sino tener un vínculo directo con lo que la clase obrera estaba discutiendo, pensando y viviendo.
And it is absolutely true what several comrades said. I'm referring to Erika and Joel and other comrades maybe, that new mass movements will come out in the next stage due to this pressure from the masses.
Y estoy totalmente de acuerdo con lo que os han dicho sobre la aparición de nuevos movimientos de masas en el periodo que viene debido a la presión que hay.
And we could say that the last wave of this movement, the left reformist movement of Syriza, of Corbyn, of Mélenchon, of Sanders, and several others, suffered a very deep and fast defeat in the last months.
Hay que decir que la última capa, la última nada de gente, digamos, izquierda, Syriza, Corbyn, Sanders, el último periodo ha sufrido una profunda derrota.
And I think that in Spain, Podemos is on the same track and moving quite fast.
Y en España Podemos se encuentra en la misma vía a toda velocidad, llegando a los mismos resultados.
And this confirms an old law that we always explained, that the right-wing reformists are in their own way consistent. They cling to the state, to the ruling class. They know what they are doing. They are prepared to do it at any cost, while the left reformists are much more inconsistent and incoherent.
Y de hecho esto es una vieja ley que hemos explicado sobre los reformistas de izquierdas, es decir, los reformistas de derecha son coherentes, están ahí preparados para el Estado, para la burguesía, etc. En cambio, los reformistas
Losing Pablo again. Pablo, are you there? Can't hear the translation.
¿Me oís?
Ahora sí.
Perdón. I kick myself out. Decía que los reformistas de izquierda son incoherentes, inconsistentes, porque no son capaces de llegar hasta el final, a diferencia de los reformistas de derechas que no tienen ningún problema de justificar.
And but since the masses have no way out, they will create new movements and new leaders in order to find some solution. And certainly we will have to work and to orientate towards this movement in the way the comrades indicated.
Y en la medida en que las masas no tienen ninguna salida, crearán otros movimientos y tendremos que participar, como los compañeros camaradas han explicado, en el seno de estos movimientos.
But certainly I would say that these phenomena are much more unstable and short-lived than in the past.
Pero creo que es importante decir que estos fenómenos son más inestables y menos duraderos que lo que habían sido.
They do not have the same roots that left reformist tendencies had in the 70s or in the 60s.
Son movimientos que no tienen las mismas raíces que tenían los 60 o 70 del siglo pasado.
And I think that while we will have, of course, all the method that the comrades explained in order to approach this phenomena, the key point in order to not just to follow them is that we are able to establish ourselves as an independent voice in the movement, as a part of the movement, as a legitimate part of the mass movement, but with a very clear profile, with a very clear political identity, which is what we are doing now. Because it is true that we are the only ones who understand that this movement are a partial, distorted, and unfinished expression of the class struggle, of the class contradiction. And for the sectarian, all these phenomena do not exist. They are not linked to the class struggle, because in their head the class struggle is only what they want what they consider such. So if it doesn't fit to the model, it is not a real class contradiction and doesn't exist.
25 minutes, Claudio.
And since it's quite late, I would like just to finish on one point. I spoke about the young revolutionary students in Italy, but that was the case in France or in many other countries in the 60s, in the 68 or 69. And when you read the reports, the memories, and the books written, some of the books at least, written on that epoch, it's really moving in some way. The way they threw themselves towards the working class, seeing it as the points of support which could give force to their revolutionary aspiration. And if you go even much more backwards in time, to the beginning of the Bolshevik party, of the Marxist movement in Russia, we see something similar. Maybe the comrades have heard, or they can read in the wonderful History of Bolshevik Party by Alan Woods, or the going to the people, when the populists, the populist revolutionaries, young students, went amongst the peasantry. And they didn't go only amongst the peasants. A section of them went towards the factories. Including Plekhanov, who was in charge of the trade union or workers or factory work of the populists at that time. And the spirit, the revolutionary spirit, was absolutely the same that we need today. They didn't have any Marxist theory to guide them, to give them a lead and an orientation. On the contrary, they had a whole host of wrong theories. And also in the 60s and 70s, those students at best had some caricature of Marxist ideas, but they were actually completely confused by Maoism, by guerrillaism, by some sort of Stalinist faction and so on. And today is not by chance that the IMT is approaching and attracting so many young people, students, school students, and in general young people in most of the countries. And this is certainly a testament of the good work our comrades are doing, but also a sign of the general process which is going on. We will continue this, we will deepen this, and we will have our own going to the people, which will be going to the working class. And this time it will be with Marxist ideas, with Marxist program, with Marxist tactics. And it will not end in any abortion, in any ultra-left movement, but it will end by building a real mass revolutionary party all over the world. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Claudio. So this is the end of the second very successful day of the International Marxist University. Yes. Tomorrow we'll reconvene again at 1 p.m. British Summer Time. We invite you to participate all to 6 different sessions of tomorrow. I must thank again all the translators, the speakers, and the technical teams, which has made today again a success. I'm sure already some comrades are asleep. But anyway, see you tomorrow, again at the third day of the International Marxist University. Bye-bye, comrades. Bye-bye. Ciao.